On a quiet Wednesday morning in Chevy Chase, Maryland, a 50-year-old woman failed to show up for work. Her employer made a phone call that would uncover a crime scene inside a residential home on Drummond Avenue, launching an investigation that would remain unsolved for over 2 decades. If this case interests you, hit subscribe to follow along as we explore how modern forensic science finally brought answers. Leslie Preer lived in the 4800 block of Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, an affluent neighborhood in Montgomery County. The morning of May 2, 2001 started like any other workday, but by mid-morning her absence raised immediate concern. When Leslie did not arrive at her workplace, her employer grew worried enough to take action. The employer began making calls to Leslie's family members, trying to locate her and understand why she had missed work without any prior notice or communication. Around 11:35 in the morning, Leslie's husband, Carl Preer, and her employer drove to the house on Drummond Avenue to check on her. What they found when they approached the residence was immediately suspicious. The scene inside the home was disturbing enough that they contacted authorities without delay. Montgomery County police officers were dispatched to the address at approximately 11:47 a.m. in response to what was reported as a suspicious situation. When officers arrived and entered the residence, they quickly identified signs of violence. Blood spatter marked the walls near the front door. Smeared blood streaked across surfaces in the foyer area. Dried blood stained the corner near the entrance. A puddle of water sat unexplained on the floor. A corner table had been knocked over, suggesting some kind of struggle or confrontation. A blood-stained rug that normally belonged in the foyer had been moved into the living room. Officers began a systematic search of the house. They moved through the first floor and then proceeded upstairs to the second level. Inside the master bathroom, they found Leslie Preer. She was deceased, her body located inside the shower stall. The positioning and condition of the scene indicated that someone had attempted to clean up evidence after the crime occurred. The Montgomery County Police immediately secured the residence as a crime scene. Investigators began the process of documenting every detail, photographing the evidence, and collecting samples that might help identify who had been inside the home. Blood evidence was recovered from multiple locations within the house. The forensic team worked methodically through each room, cataloging the physical signs of what had transpired. An autopsy was conducted to determine the cause and manner of death. The medical examiner found that Leslie had sustained 7 separate lacerations to her head. The injuries indicated blunt force trauma. Additionally, evidence showed that she had been strangled. The autopsy results revealed that her head had been battered against the foyer floor and against the sharp edges of the shoe molding that surrounded the foyer and front door area. The combination of injuries painted a picture of a violent attack that had begun near the entrance of the house. The investigation began in earnest. Detectives interviewed family members, neighbors, and anyone who might have information about Leslie's final hours. They processed the crime scene for fingerprints, DNA, and any other trace evidence that could lead to a suspect. Blood evidence collected from the scene was preserved and documented according to standard forensic protocols. Samples were stored for future analysis as the investigation moved forward. The case was officially classified as a homicide. Montgomery County detectives worked to establish a timeline of events, determined who might have had access to the home, and identify potential suspects. The investigation remained active in those early days, with officers following leads and conducting interviews throughout the Chevy Chase community.
The physical evidence inside Leslie Preer's home told investigators that a violent confrontation had occurred near the entrance and continued through multiple areas of the residence. Detectives carefully documented each detail as they worked to understand exactly what had happened during the final moments of her life. The attack appeared to have begun in the foyer, just inside the front door. Blood spatter patterns on the walls indicated the location where the initial blows were struck. The distribution and direction of the blood suggested that Leslie had been struck multiple times in that confined space near the entrance. The corner table that normally stood in the foyer had been knocked over during the struggle, evidence of the force and chaos of the encounter. Blood was not limited to one area. Smears stretched across the walls, indicating movement and contact as the attack progressed. Dried blood marked the corner adjacent to the front door. The sharp edges of the shoe molding that framed the foyer and doorway showed signs of impact, consistent with the autopsy findings that Leslie's head had been battered against these surfaces. The flooring in the foyer bore evidence of the assault, with blood residue embedded in the material. A blood-stained rug that belonged in the entryway had been moved to the living room. This deliberate relocation suggested that someone had attempted to alter the scene after the violence ended. Additionally, investigators found a puddle of water on the floor with no apparent source or explanation. The water raised questions about cleanup efforts or other actions taken after Leslie's death. The trail of evidence led investigators upstairs to the master bathroom. Leslie's body was found inside the shower stall, a location that further indicated post-crime scene manipulation. The shower placement suggested an attempt to wash away evidence or conceal aspects of what had occurred. Detectives photographed the body's position and the surrounding area, noting every detail that might prove relevant. The medical examiner's autopsy provided critical information about the nature and extent of Leslie's injuries. She had sustained 7 distinct lacerations to her head, wounds consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. The severity and number of injuries indicated a sustained attack rather than a single blow. Beyond the head trauma, the autopsy revealed that Leslie had also been strangled. The combination of strangulation and blunt force trauma demonstrated the brutality of the assault. The autopsy report specifically noted that Leslie's head had been struck against the foyer floor and against the sharp shoe molding surrounding the entrance area. These findings corroborated the blood evidence found in the foyer, confirming that location as the primary site of the attack. The injuries were severe enough to cause death, and the medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide. Forensic technicians collected blood samples from multiple locations throughout the home. These samples were carefully preserved and cataloged for DNA analysis. In 2001, DNA technology was advancing, but not yet at the sophisticated level it would reach in later years. The collected samples were processed and entered into evidence, with profiles developed from the biological material found at the scene. Investigators also searched for fingerprints, looking for any impressions that might identify who had been inside the home. They examined windows and doors for signs of forced entry. They documented the condition of locks and determined whether the perpetrator had gained access through an unlocked door or had been let inside by Leslie herself. The crime scene processing took considerable time. Every room was examined. Every surface was checked for potential evidence. Photographs captured the state of the home from multiple angles. Investigators created detailed reports describing the location and condition of each piece of evidence collected. The work was methodical and thorough, building a comprehensive record of what physical evidence existed. The blood evidence would prove to be the most significant material collected from the scene, though investigators in 2001 could not yet know how crucial those samples would eventually become.
Montgomery County detectives began working the investigation immediately after the crime scene processing was complete. The blood evidence collected from the Drummond Avenue residence was sent to the laboratory for DNA analysis. In 2001, forensic DNA technology had advanced significantly from its early days, but still faced limitations compared to what would be available decades later. The lab technicians extracted DNA profiles from the biological samples found at the scene and began the work of comparison and identification. The DNA evidence yielded results. A profile was developed from blood found inside the home. Investigators now had a genetic fingerprint that could potentially identify the person responsible for Leslie's death. The profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System that maintains DNA records from convicted offenders and unsolved crime scenes across the United States. Detectives waited to see if the system would produce a match to a known individual. No match came back from CODIS. The DNA profile did not correspond to anyone already in the criminal database. This meant that either the person responsible had never been convicted of a crime requiring DNA submission, or their sample had not yet been entered into the system. The lack of a database hit was disappointing, but not uncommon in investigations during that era.
Detectives conducted interviews with family members to establish Leslie's routine, her relationships, and any potential conflicts or threats she might have faced. They spoke with neighbors in the Chevy Chase area, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on May 2 or in the days leading up to the discovery of her body. They canvassed the neighborhood systematically, documenting every conversation and following up on any information that seemed potentially relevant. The investigation included examining Leslie's personal and professional life. Detectives looked at her work relationships, her social connections, and her daily activities. They attempted to identify anyone who might have had a reason to harm her or who might have been inside her home that day. Every lead was documented and pursued to the extent possible with available information. In January 2002, approximately 8 months after Leslie's death, a tip came into the Montgomery County Police Department. A neighbor contacted investigators with information about a possible suspect. The neighbor mentioned Eugene Gligor, who had at one time been the boyfriend of Leslie's teenage daughter, Lauren. The neighbor thought Gligor might be connected to the homicide and felt the information was worth reporting to authorities. The tip was documented in the investigative file. Detectives noted the information provided by the neighbor. The Gligor family and the Prier family had known each other as both lived in the same Chevy Chase neighborhood. Eugene had dated Lauren when they were both teenagers, making him someone who would have been familiar with the Prier household and potentially had access to the home. Despite the tip naming Gligor, the investigation did not focus heavily on him at that time. The reasons for this decision are not detailed in available records. It is unclear whether detectives interviewed Gligor, requested a DNA sample from him, or pursued the lead in any substantial way. The tip was filed as part of the investigative record, but did not immediately lead to significant action or breakthrough. Detectives continued working other angles and following other leads. They maintained the DNA evidence in storage, preserving the samples according to proper protocols. The profile remained in CODIS, waiting for a future match that might come if the responsible individual was later arrested and required to provide a DNA sample for an unrelated offense. As weeks turned into months, the active investigation began to slow. Leads were exhausted without producing a clear suspect. The DNA evidence sat in storage, its potential unrealized, without a matching profile to compare it against. The blood samples collected from the Drummond Avenue crime scene represented the strongest physical evidence available, but without advanced technology or a database match, their value remained limited. The investigation remained officially open. The file was not closed, and detectives did not abandon the effort to solve Leslie's murder. But without new leads or breakthroughs, the intensity of active investigative work diminished. The homicide joined the growing list of unsolved cases that Montgomery County detectives hoped to one day resolve.
Leslie Jennings Prier was 50 years old at the time of her death in May 2001. She lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland, a well-established community in Montgomery County known for its tree-lined streets and residential stability. Leslie was married to Carl Prier, and together they had a daughter named Lauren. Leslie maintained steady employment, working at a job where her attendance was consistent enough that her absence on May 2nd immediately raised concern among her colleagues. Her employer knew her well enough to recognize that failing to show up without communication was uncharacteristic behavior. That recognition prompted the calls to family members and ultimately led to the discovery of what had happened inside her home. Leslie had a relationship with her daughter Lauren that included involvement in Lauren's social life during her teenage years. Lauren had dated Eugene Gligor when both were 15 years old, and the families knew each other through their shared residence in the Chevy Chase neighborhood. The connection between the Prier and Gligor families was social and geographical, rooted in the proximity of their homes and the relationship between the two teenagers. The Prier family residence on Drummond Avenue was the location where Leslie spent her final hours. The home represented not just a physical structure, but the center of family life, where daily routines unfolded. On May 2, 2001, that familiar space became a crime scene, forever changing its significance for those who knew Leslie. Beyond these documented facts,
The public record provides limited detail about Leslie's personal history, her interests, or her daily activities. What is known comes primarily from the investigative reports and news coverage that followed her death. The focus of available information centers on the events of May 2nd and the subsequent investigation rather than extensive biographical background. Leslie's absence from work that morning served as the first indicator that something was wrong. Her employer's decision to contact family members demonstrated a level of concern based on knowing Leslie's patterns and reliability. That simple act of reaching out set in motion the chain of events that led Carl Preer and the employer to the Drummond Avenue residence. The discovery of her death left family members facing an unimaginable loss. Lauren, who was 24 years old at the time, lost her mother under violent circumstances that remained unexplained. Carl lost his wife in a crime that produced few immediate answers. The family would spend the next 2 decades living with uncertainty about who had been responsible and why the attack had occurred. Leslie's death occurred in her own home, a place that should have represented safety and security. The violation of that space and the violence inflicted upon her within those walls added another dimension to the tragedy that her family and the community experienced. Years passed without resolution in Leslie Preer's murder. The investigation remained officially open, but active detective work had largely ceased as all immediate leads were exhausted. The DNA evidence sat in storage, preserved but unused, waiting for circumstances that would allow it to fulfill its potential as identifying evidence. The blood samples collected in May 2001 held answers, but the technology and investigative tools needed to extract those answers were not yet available. The Montgomery County Police Department maintained the file as part of their cold case inventory. Cold cases represent investigations where initial efforts have not produced an arrest or resolution, but where evidence and documentation remain available for future review. Leslie's murder joined the ranks of unsolved homicides that detectives hoped to one day close through new leads, witness cooperation, or technological advances. By May 2022, 21 years had elapsed since Leslie's death. The Montgomery County Police Department's cold case section made a decision to bring renewed attention to the investigation. On May 5, 2022, the department issued a public appeal for information. The press release detailed the basic facts of the homicide, describing how Leslie had been found deceased inside her Drummond Avenue residence on May 2, 2001, with apparent trauma to her body. The department announced a reward of up to $10,000 for information leading to the arrest of the suspect or suspects responsible. The announcement emphasized that callers could remain anonymous and provided multiple contact methods, including a dedicated cold case unit phone line and the Crime Solvers of Montgomery County toll-free number. The public appeal was an attempt to generate new leads or encourage witnesses who might not have come forward previously. The press release included photographs of Leslie taken in 1997 and 2000, images from before her death that showed her as she had been in life. The photographs personalized the appeal, putting a face to the name and reminding the public that behind the unsolved homicide was a person whose family still sought answers. Despite the public appeal and offered reward, no significant breakthroughs emerged immediately from the renewed publicity. The investigation remained at a standstill, dependent on developments that existed outside the traditional scope of detective work. What the public did not know in May 2022 was that behind the scenes, investigators and prosecutors had already made a decision that would eventually change everything about the investigation. In September 2022, 4 months after the public appeal, the Montgomery County Police Department took a critical step. Detectives retrieved the blood evidence that had been collected from the crime scene in 2001 and made arrangements to send it to a specialized laboratory. The destination was Othram Inc. Labs, a facility that offered a relatively new investigative technique known as forensic genetic genealogy (DNA) analysis. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy represented a shift in strategy. Traditional DNA comparison relied on finding a match in criminal databases, but genetic genealogy used a different approach entirely.
The technique had gained prominence in recent years through its success in solving other long-dormant cases, and Montgomery County investigators believed it might offer the breakthrough they needed.
The results from Othram Inc. labs arrived after months of specialized analysis on the blood evidence submitted in September 2022. The forensic genetic genealogy process had yielded information that traditional DNA database searches could never have provided. Instead of simply checking for an exact match in criminal databases, the genetic genealogy approach built a family tree based on shared DNA segments found in publicly accessible genealogy websites. The laboratory had uploaded the DNA profile developed from the crime scene blood to the Family Tree DNA database, one of the genealogy platforms where users voluntarily submit their genetic information to explore ancestry and find relatives. The system identified a list of individuals who shared DNA with the unknown profile from Leslie Preer's home. These matches were not exact, but they represented genetic relatives at varying degrees of separation. Genealogists working on the analysis began constructing family trees based on the shared DNA matches. They traced lineages backward and forward, identifying common ancestors and mapping out branches of related individuals. Through careful examination of birth records, marriage records, census data, and other genealogical sources, a pattern emerged. Multiple branches of the constructed family tree pointed toward one surname that appeared repeatedly in the analysis. The name was Gligor. Montgomery County detectives received the genealogy results and immediately recognized the significance. That surname was not new to the investigation. When investigators pulled the original file from 2001 and 2002, they found the tip that had been called in by a neighbor in January 2002. The neighbor had specifically mentioned Eugene Gligor, suggesting he might be related to Leslie's homicide. The tip had been documented but not aggressively pursued at the time. Eugene Gligor had dated Lauren Preer when both were teenagers. The families had known each other, living in the same Chevy Chase neighborhood. Eugene would have been familiar with the Preer household and potentially had access to the home on Drummond Avenue. The connection was personal and geographical, rooted in a relationship that had ended years before Leslie's death. The 2002 tip now took on new weight. What had been a single neighbor's suspicion filed away in the investigative record had been independently corroborated by cutting-edge forensic science. The genetic genealogy analysis had arrived at the same surname without any input about the prior tip or the teenage relationship between Eugene and Lauren. The convergence of the old tip and the new DNA results created a compelling reason to focus investigative attention on Eugene Theodore Gligor. Detectives began gathering information about Gligor's current whereabouts and circumstances. By 2024, he was 44 years old and living in Northwest Washington, D.C. He had never been arrested for crimes that would have required DNA submission to CODIS, which explained why the blood evidence from 2001 had never produced a database match. His DNA profile simply did not exist in the criminal system. The genetic genealogy results were not definitive proof of guilt. Montgomery County State Attorney John McCarthy would later describe the technique as providing a lead rather than conclusive evidence. The genealogy analysis could identify a family line and narrow down possibilities, but it could not definitively state that a specific individual was the source of the crime scene DNA. Additional steps would be necessary to confirm whether Eugene Gligor was in fact the person whose blood had been found inside Leslie Preer's home. Detectives needed a direct DNA sample from Gligor to compare against the profile developed from the blood evidence. Obtaining such a sample required careful planning. If they approached Gligor directly and requested voluntary cooperation, he could refuse and potentially flee or destroy evidence. If they sought a court order for a DNA sample, the legal process might alert him before they were ready to make an arrest. The decision was made to place Gligor under surveillance. Detectives would monitor his movements and wait for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample without his knowledge. The method they chose relied on something that people discard routinely in public spaces without consideration for what might be done with those items afterward. Forensic genetic genealogy represented a fundamental shift in how investigators could approach cold cases with DNA evidence, but no suspect matches in traditional criminal databases. The technique emerged from the intersection of commercial ancestry testing and criminal investigation, creating possibilities that had not existed when Leslie Preer's murder occurred in 2001. Traditional DNA analysis in criminal investigations relied on comparison. A profile developed from crime scene evidence was checked against profiles in CODIS, the national database containing DNA from convicted offenders and arrestees. If no match existed in CODIS, the DNA evidence could exclude suspects but could not identify unknown perpetrators. Millions of criminal cases sat unsolved because the responsible individuals had never been arrested or convicted of crimes requiring DNA submission. Forensic genetic genealogy offered an alternative path. The method used the same DNA profiles developed from crime scene evidence, but instead of searching criminal databases, investigators uploaded those profiles to publicly accessible genealogy websites where people voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about ancestry and find relatives. These genealogy databases contained millions of profiles from ordinary people interested in family history rather than criminal activity. When a crime scene DNA profile was uploaded to a genealogy database, the system identified other users who shared DNA segments with the unknown profile. These matches were not exact, but they represented genetic relatives at varying distances. Someone might share enough DNA to be a third cousin, fourth cousin, or even more distant relation. The shared DNA indicated a common ancestor somewhere in the family tree, even if that ancestor lived generations in the past. Professional genealogists trained in both traditional genealogical research and genetic analysis then took over the investigative work. They examined the list of DNA matches and began building family trees. Using birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries, and other genealogical sources, they traced lineages backward to identify common ancestors. Once common ancestors were located, the genealogists worked forward through subsequent generations, mapping out all descendants and creating comprehensive family trees. The process required painstaking research and careful documentation. A single family tree might include hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. Genealogists had to verify relationships, confirm dates, and account for name changes, adoptions, and other complications that affect family structures. The work combined traditional detective research with genetic science, using DNA as a guide to narrow down possibilities within large family networks. In the Leslie Preer investigation, the blood evidence collected in 2001 was sent to Othram Inc. labs in September 2022. Othram specialized in forensic genetic genealogy and had developed expertise in extracting usable DNA profiles from degraded or limited biological samples. The laboratory processed the blood evidence and developed a genetic profile suitable for genealogy database comparison. The profile was uploaded to the Family Tree DNA database. The system returned a list of individuals who shared DNA segments with the crime scene profile. These matches represented people who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to explore their ancestry and had unknowingly become genetic witnesses in a murder investigation. None of these matching individuals were suspects, but their DNA provided clues about the family lineage of the actual perpetrator. Genealogists working on the analysis began constructing trees based on the shared matches. They identified common ancestors and traced descendant lines through multiple generations. The work took months of dedicated effort, cross-referencing genealogical records and verifying relationships. As the family trees took shape, patterns emerged. Certain surnames appeared repeatedly across different branches of related individuals. The Gligor surname emerged from the genealogical analysis as a significant connection point. Multiple branches of the constructed family trees pointed toward individuals bearing that name.
The genealogists provided Montgomery County investigators with their findings, identifying the Gligor surname as a strong candidate for further investigation based on the genetic evidence. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy later explained that genetic genealogy provides a lead rather than definitive proof. The technique can narrow down possibilities and point investigators towards specific family lines, but it cannot definitively identify a single individual as the source of crime scene DNA. The genealogy work identifies a pool of possible relatives, and traditional detective work must then determine which specific person within that family network was actually present at the crime scene area. The genealogy results gave investigators direction. They had moved from having an unidentified DNA profile with no leads to having a specific surname and family network to examine. The next step required connecting the genealogical findings to actual individuals who could have been in Chevy Chase, Maryland in May 2001 and who had some connection to Leslie Preer or her family. When detectives reviewed the original investigation file with the Gligor surname in mind, they found the January 2002 tip that had mentioned Eugene Gligor by name. The convergence was striking. A neighbor had suggested Eugene Gligor as potentially connected to the homicide more than 20 years ago, and now genetic genealogy had arrived at the same surname through purely scientific analysis. The old tip and the new technology pointed in the same direction.
Montgomery County police detectives began surveillance operations on Eugene Gligor in early June 2024. The surveillance teams tracked his movements throughout Washington, D.C., documenting his daily routines and activities. The goal was to obtain a DNA sample that could be compared against the profile developed from the blood evidence found at Leslie Preer's crime scene. Detectives needed that comparison to confirm whether the genetic genealogy analysis had correctly identified Gligor as the source of the DNA. The surveillance teams followed standard protocols for monitoring a suspect without alerting him to their presence. Officers maintained distance, rotated positions, and used unmarked vehicles to avoid detection. They documented where Gligor went, who he met with, and what activities he engaged in during his normal routine. Throughout the surveillance, detectives watched for opportunities to collect discarded items that might contain his DNA. On June 9, 2024, surveillance officers followed Gligor to Dulles International Airport in Virginia. Dulles serves the Washington metropolitan area and handles millions of passengers annually. The airport's public spaces provided an environment where people routinely discard items without consideration for who might retrieve them afterward. Detectives maintained visual contact with Gligor as he moved through the airport. The moment the bottle left his possession and entered the trash, it became abandoned property. Under established legal principles, abandoned property carries no expectation of privacy, meaning law enforcement can collect and examine such items without a warrant. Detectives immediately moved to secure the discarded water bottle before it could be contaminated by other trash or removed by airport cleaning staff. The bottle was carefully retrieved and placed into evidence containers to preserve any biological material present. The rim of the bottle, where Gligor's mouth had made contact while drinking, would contain saliva cells suitable for DNA extraction and analysis. The water bottle was transported to a forensic laboratory for processing. Technicians extracted DNA from the saliva residue on the bottle's rim and developed a genetic profile. This profile represented a known sample directly attributable to Eugene Gligor, taken from an item he had personally used and then abandoned in a public location. The laboratory then conducted a comparison analysis. The genetic profile from the water bottle was placed alongside the profile that had been developed from the blood evidence collected at the Drummond Avenue crime scene in May 2001. Forensic analysts examined the genetic markers that make each person's DNA unique, looking for matches or exclusions across multiple points of comparison. The analysis generated a positive match. The genetic profile from the water bottle was consistent with the genetic profile from the blood found inside Leslie Prayer's home in May 2001. The probability of the match occurring by random chance was calculated to be astronomically small, well beyond the threshold used in forensic science to establish identity. The comparison indicated that Eugene Glicker had been the source of the blood evidence collected from the crime scene 23 years earlier. The DNA match provided the confirmation that detectives needed. The genetic genealogy work had pointed them toward the Glicker surname. The old tip from 2002 had identified Eugene Glicker specifically, and now the direct DNA comparison proved that Eugene Glicker's blood had been present at the scene where Leslie Preer was killed. The scientific evidence connected him to the location where the violent attack occurred. Montgomery County investigators compiled the evidence and presented their findings to prosecutors. The DNA match, combined with the circumstances of the original investigation and the relationship history between Glicker and the Preer family, formed the basis for criminal charges. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and determined that sufficient probable cause existed to seek an arrest warrant. On Saturday, June 15, 2024, prosecutors requested and obtained an arrest warrant for Eugene Theodore Glicker. The warrant charged him with first-degree murder in the death of Leslie Preer. The charge carried the potential of life imprisonment under Maryland law. The warrant authorized law enforcement to take Glicker into custody and bring him before the court to answer for the allegations against him. The breakthrough had come through a combination of old-fashioned detective work, cutting-edge genetic science, and patient surveillance. A case that had remained unsolved for 23 years now had a named suspect and physical evidence linking him to the crime scene.
On Tuesday, June 18, 2024, the United States Marshals Service Task Force executed the arrest warrant for Eugene Theodore Glicker in Washington, D.C. Federal marshals located Glicker at his residence in Northwest Washington and took him into custody without incident. He was 44 years old at the time of his arrest, exactly 23 years and 16 days after Leslie Preer's body had been discovered inside her Chevy Chase home. The arrest brought sudden and dramatic change to what had been an ordinary day in Glicker's life. He was transported to a detention facility where he would be held pending his initial court appearance. The charges against him were severe, carrying the potential of life imprisonment if convicted. Maryland law classified first-degree murder as the most serious category of criminal homicide, requiring proof that the killing was both willful and premeditated. The Montgomery County Police Department announced the arrest publicly on the same day. The department issued a press release detailing how detectives from the Cold Case section had closed a 23-year-old investigation through the use of forensic genetic genealogy. The announcement explained that DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene in 2001 had been submitted for specialized analysis in September 2022, leading to the identification of Glicker as a potential suspect. The press release described how detectives collected DNA evidence belonging to Glicker on June 9, 2024, and how laboratory comparison generated a positive match to the DNA recovered from the crime scene. The announcement noted that Glicker had been charged with first-degree murder and that an arrest warrant had been obtained on June 15 before his apprehension 3 days later. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy spoke to media outside the courthouse, praising the work of the police department's cold case unit. McCarthy emphasized that the investigation had remained open for more than 2 decades, with detectives maintaining their commitment to finding answers despite the passage of time. He described the investigative work as extraordinary and noted that the victim's family was thankful for the persistence shown by law enforcement. McCarthy also explained the significance of forensic genetic genealogy in solving the investigation. He clarified that while the technique was not definitive proof by itself, it provided crucial leads that allowed detectives to focus their efforts productively. The genealogy work had opened up possibilities that traditional DNA database searches could never have achieved, particularly in situations where the responsible individual had no prior criminal record requiring DNA submission. Glicker made his first court appearance on Monday, June 24, 2024, before a Montgomery County judge.
He appeared in court to face the first-degree murder charge and hear the allegations against him. During the proceedings, Gliger did not speak. His preliminary hearing was scheduled for July 19, giving his defense attorney time to review the evidence and prepare a response to the charges. The judge ordered Gliger held without bond, meaning he would remain in custody throughout the pretrial process. The decision to deny bond reflected the severity of the charges and the potential flight risk posed by a defendant facing life imprisonment. Gliger was remanded to the Montgomery County Detention Center to await further court proceedings. The arrest warrant also served as a detainer for extradition purposes. Although Gliger had been arrested in Washington, D.C., the charges originated in Montgomery County, Maryland. The legal process required formal extradition to transfer him from D.C. custody to Maryland jurisdiction. The warrant provided the legal authority for that transfer, ensuring Gliger would be brought before the appropriate Maryland court to face the murder charge. Court documents filed in connection with the arrest detailed the evidence supporting the charges. The documents outlined the crime scene findings from May 2001, the DNA evidence collected at that time, the forensic genetic genealogy analysis conducted in 2022 and 2023, the surveillance operation at Dulles Airport, and the DNA match between the water bottle and the crime scene blood. The documentation provided a comprehensive record of how investigators had connected Gliger to Leslie Preer's death after more than 2 decades. The legal proceedings were now underway. What had been an unsolved cold case for 23 years had transformed into an active prosecution with a defendant in custody and evidence ready for presentation in court.
Lauren Preer learned that Eugene Gliger had been arrested and charged with her mother's murder 23 years after the crime occurred. The revelation was difficult to process. Eugene had been her boyfriend when both were 15 years old, a teenage relationship that had ended years before her mother's death. The families had known each other, living in the same Chevy Chase neighborhood where social connections and proximity created familiarity between households. Lauren spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after Gliger's initial appearance. She described her reaction to the arrest as shock, struggling to reconcile the person she had known with the allegations now being made against him. The idea that someone from within their social circle, someone her family had welcomed and trusted, could have been responsible for her mother's murder was nearly impossible to accept. Lauren told reporters that she and Eugene had dated when they were both teenagers. The relationship had been a normal part of adolescence, the kind of connection that forms and dissolves during high school years. After they broke up, both moved on with their lives. Lauren had no reason to suspect Eugene of any involvement in what happened to her mother. The thought simply never entered her mind during the 2 decades that followed. What made the revelation even more surreal was an encounter that had occurred years after Leslie's death. Lauren recounted meeting Eugene at a restaurant in Washington, D.C. at some point during the intervening years. They spoke to each other during that encounter, engaging in conversation as if nothing extraordinary connected them. The interaction was normal, unremarkable, lacking any indication of the violence that had occurred or the secret that Eugene allegedly carried. Lauren described that restaurant meeting as evidence of how completely unsuspecting Eugene had been. If she had harbored any suspicion or doubt about him, such a casual encounter would have been impossible. Instead, they had talked as former acquaintances catching up, with Lauren having no awareness that the person across from her might have been responsible for her mother's death. The phrase Lauren used to describe the arrest and revelation was that it felt unreal. The word captured the disconnect between her memories and experiences with Eugene and the accusations now being leveled against him. The Eugene she had known as a teenager, the person she had dated, and whose family had been friendly with her own, did not align with the image of someone capable of the violence inflicted upon her mother. Lauren emphasized to reporters that her family had never suspected Eugene. She stated clearly that they would never have imagined one of their own people could hurt her mother. The use of the phrase, "our people," indicated how close the social connection had been. Eugene was not a stranger or outsider, but someone within their community circle, someone they had known and interacted with regularly. The arrest forced Lauren and her family to reevaluate memories and past interactions through a new and disturbing lens. Moments that had seemed innocent or unremarkable when they occurred now carried different potential meanings. The restaurant encounter in particular took on new significance, representing a time when Lauren had been in the presence of the alleged killer without any awareness of what he had done. The psychological impact of learning that someone familiar had allegedly committed such violence added another layer to the trauma the family had already endured. The initial loss of Leslie had been devastating. The decades without answers had been difficult. Now the arrest brought not closure, but rather a different kind of pain, rooted in betrayal and the violation of trust that came from discovering the accused was someone they had known. Lauren's public statements reflected both the shock of the arrest and her support for the legal process now underway. She acknowledged the work of the Montgomery County Police Cold Case Unit and expressed gratitude for their persistence. After 23 years of uncertainty, there was finally movement toward potential accountability, even if the identity of the accused made that progress deeply painful.
Nearly a year after his arrest, Eugene Theodore Gleeger appeared in Montgomery County Circuit Court to enter a plea in the death of Leslie Preer. The proceeding took place on May 7, 2025, almost exactly 24 years after Leslie's body had been discovered inside her Chevy Chase home. Gleeger, now 45 years old, stood before the court to formally respond to the charges that had been filed against him. The original charge of first-degree murder required prosecutors to prove that the killing had been both willful and premeditated, demonstrating that Gleeger had planned the attack in advance. However, prosecutors determined that the available evidence did not support a finding of premeditation. While the DNA evidence conclusively placed Gleeger at the crime scene and the autopsy findings demonstrated the violent nature of the attack, there was no documented evidence showing that he had planned Leslie's death beforehand. Without proof of premeditation, a first-degree murder conviction would be difficult to secure. Prosecutors made the decision to proceed with a charge of second-degree murder instead. Second-degree murder under Maryland law encompasses intentional killings that occur without premeditation, including killings committed in the heat of passion or during the commission of another crime. The charge still carried substantial prison time but did not require proving advanced planning. Gleeger accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Leslie Preer. By entering a guilty plea, he admitted legal responsibility for her death and waived his right to a trial. The plea meant that the question of guilt or innocence would not be decided by a jury. Instead, the court would move directly to sentencing, where a judge would determine the appropriate punishment. During the court proceedings, Gleeger made a statement taking responsibility for what had happened. He apologized for his actions and provided an explanation for his behavior on May 2, 2001. Gleeger claimed that at the time of the attack, he had been drinking alcohol and using cocaine. He attributed the violence to being under the influence of these substances, suggesting that intoxication had impaired his judgment and contributed to the tragic outcome. Gleeger also made a specific statement about Leslie herself. He told the courtroom that Leslie had always been very kind to him. The remark acknowledged the relationship that had existed between them through his connection to the Preer family. Leslie had known Eugene through his teenage relationship with her daughter Lauren, and by his own account, she had treated him with kindness during that time. The plea hearing also included victim impact statements from members of Leslie's family. A total of 7 family members addressed the court, describing how Leslie's death had affected their lives over the past 24 years. The statements provided the court with insight into the human cost of the crime, detailing the grief, loss, and unanswered questions that had dominated the family's experience since May 2001. Lauren Preer was among those who provided a victim impact statement. She spoke about losing her mother under violent circumstances and living with the uncertainty of not knowing who was responsible or why the attack had occurred. The arrest and subsequent legal proceedings had finally provided answers, but those answers came with the painful realization that someone she had once known and trusted had been responsible. The plea agreement represented a significant development in the legal proceedings. It eliminated the need for a trial, sparing the family from having to endure weeks or months of courtroom testimony and evidence presentation. It also removed any doubt about Gleeger's legal culpability, as his own admission of guilt settled the question of responsibility.
The plea agreement included sentencing recommendations, but the final decision rested with the judge. Maryland's sentencing guidelines for second-degree murder provided a range of 10 to 18 years imprisonment. However, prosecutors indicated they would be seeking a sentence above those guidelines, given the circumstances of the crime and the extended period during which the family had been denied justice. The court scheduled a formal sentencing hearing where the judge would determine the specific prison term that Gliger would serve. That hearing would consider the victim impact statements, the details of the crime itself, Gliger's lack of prior criminal history, and the aggravating factors present in the killing of Leslie Preer.
The sentencing hearing for Eugene Theodore Gligor took place on Thursday, August 28, 2025, in Montgomery County Circuit Court. More than 24 years had passed since Leslie Preer's death, and the courtroom now gathered to determine what punishment would be imposed for the crime Gligor had admitted committing. Family members filled the courtroom, waiting to hear the judge's decision on how many years Gligor would spend in prison. The prosecution had requested a sentence of 30 years, a term significantly above the standard sentencing guidelines for second-degree murder in Maryland. The guidelines typically suggested a range of 10 to 18 years for such convictions, but prosecutors argued that the circumstances of Leslie's death warranted a substantially longer term. The brutality of the attack, the extended suffering inflicted on the victim's family during the decades without answers, and the deliberate nature of the violence all supported a sentence at the higher end of possibilities. The judge considered the evidence presented during the plea hearing and the victim impact statements provided by 7 family members. The court had reviewed graphic photographs from the crime scene showing the blood evidence and signs of struggle inside the Drummond Avenue home. The autopsy findings detailing the 7 lacerations to Leslie's head and the strangulation had been entered into the record. The judge had heard Gligor's own statement acknowledging his responsibility and his claim that alcohol and cocaine use had contributed to his actions. The court announced its decision. Eugene Gligor was sentenced to 30 years in prison. However, the sentence was structured with 8 years suspended, meaning Gligor would actually serve 22 years behind bars before being released. After completing the 22-year prison term, he would be subject to 5 years of supervised probation. The structured sentence meant that Gligor would remain under some form of legal supervision for a total of 27 years. As the judge pronounced the sentence, family members in the courtroom reacted audibly. Several shouted the word "yes," expressing relief and satisfaction that a substantial prison term had been imposed. The reaction reflected years of waiting for accountability and the emotional release that came with finally seeing legal consequences applied to the person responsible for Leslie's death. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy spoke after the sentencing, emphasizing the significance of the resolution. He noted that the investigation had remained open for 23 years before forensic genetic genealogy provided the breakthrough that led to Gligor's identification and arrest. McCarthy praised the cold case unit for their extraordinary work and persistence, highlighting how detectives had maintained their commitment to solving the murder despite the passage of time. The sentencing marked the formal conclusion of the criminal proceedings. Gligor would be transferred to a Maryland correctional facility to begin serving his 22-year term. At 45 years old when sentenced, he would be approximately 67 years old upon his release from prison if he served the full term without early release or modification. The resolution brought a measure of closure to Leslie's family, though the years lost could never be recovered. Lauren Preer and other family members had lived for more than 2 decades not knowing who had killed Leslie or why the attack had occurred. The DNA evidence and genetic genealogy work had finally provided those answers, leading to an arrest and conviction that had seemed impossible for so long. The investigation demonstrated how advances in forensic science can breathe new life into cold cases that appeared unsolvable through traditional methods. The blood evidence collected in 2001 had been properly preserved, allowing it to be reanalyzed with technology that did not exist at the time of the original investigation. The genetic genealogy technique, combined with patient detective work and modern surveillance methods, created the pathway to identifying Gligor when conventional DNA database searches had failed. The resolution also highlighted the importance of maintaining cold case units and dedicating resources to unsolved investigations. Without the decision to revisit Leslie's murder in 2022 and pursue genetic genealogy analysis, the evidence would have continued sitting in storage with no resolution in sight. The commitment to seeking justice, no matter how much time had passed, made the difference between permanent uncertainty and eventual accountability. The legal proceedings had taken Leslie's family through multiple stages of emotion and experience. The initial shock of the arrest, the difficulty of learning that someone they had known was responsible, the relief of the guilty plea that avoided a lengthy trial, and finally the satisfaction of seeing a substantial prison sentence imposed. Each stage brought its own challenges and revelations. The sentencing concluded a criminal investigation that spanned nearly a quarter-century, involved multiple generations of detectives, and required the application of scientific techniques that did not exist when the crime occurred. The resolution represented both an ending and an acknowledgement that some wounds, while they may find legal closure, carry impacts that extend far beyond any courtroom.